Now, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, 4Air. 4Air is leading the way with the industry's first framework to address aviation's climate impact, offering clear, verifiable pathways to reduce and counteract aircraft emissions. Their new Assure SAF registry is making it easier than ever to manage and claim sustainable aviation fuel usage across the value chain. Want to learn more? Check out the show notes.
So we looked at landing charges and introduced a scheme where basically we raise charges a little bit for every airline each year to create a pot of money. And we then set a target. So 2022, we started at 0.5%, and then each year it's gone up a bit to 1.5%. So we want 2.5% of all fuel at Heathrow this year to be sustainable fuel. So we create the pot, and airlines then bid into that pot. And at the end of the year, airlines have to provide evidence that they've uplifted the SAF, and then they get a rebate. So if you're an airline, and you know SAF is more expensive, this helps close that price gap.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simply Flying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Matthew Gorman. Matthew is the Director of Carbon Strategy and Sustainability at London's Heathrow Airport. For 15 years, he has been leading the sustainability charge at Heathrow. He was also the chair of Sustainable Aviation, a unique coalition of UK airlines, airports, aircraft and engine manufacturers to promote sustainable, cleaner, quieter flying. Matthew has a wealth of knowledge on how do you decarbonize not just a very large airport like Heathrow, but also aviation as a whole, because anything that Heathrow does also impacts not just the airlines operating out of there, but also airports around the world. I hope you enjoy this fascinating conversation I have with Matthew. Matt, it's a pleasure speaking with you finally. You've got a big charge leading sustainability at Heathrow. What does that entail?
Well, it entails a lot, but fortunately, it's something I'm really passionate about. So just the quick bit of backstory on me, I've been passionate about environment for a long time. I think I first got really fired up by green issues when I was a teenager growing up. I'd, launch recycling campaigns at school, be writing to my MP. And that just guided both my studies and then my career through a mix of consultancy, think tanks, and then decided that I really wanted to work in business, driving change within one organization. Actually, it was kind of by chance that I ended up in aviation. I was looking at various options, but have just got really passionate about the opportunities and the real pressing need, clearly, but the opportunity to drive sustainability in aviation. So I've been at Heathrow leading the sustainability and then more recently the carbon teams for about 16 years now. And it entails working out what are the big issues for us as an airport, working out what's the right level of ambition on those issues, and we can talk a bit more about that as we go through. Yes, carbon, but the noise and air pollution agenda, but also what are some of the positives of the business and how do we promote and enhance some of those positive jobs and skills and connectivity benefits of aviation. And it's great because it brings together my passion for green issues, but also a passion for travel, which I've enjoyed over the years. And we're not going to continue to protect those amazing benefits of international air travel unless we're really leaning into sustainability. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wow, thank you. 16 years in sustainability. I don't think I've heard of that before. Sustainability seems to be the new flavor for most airlines and airports, which has arisen in the last 2 to 5 years, and they're scampering to find someone who knows something about sustainability or environment. 16 years. How has the role evolved and how has sustainability at the airport changed?
Great question. I mean, actually, if I cast it right back to the beginning of my career, it'd be more like 25 years now. But that's a really interesting illustration because you're right. When I first started, I'd always been passionate about these issues. There was a kind of a relatively small group of people at that stage across business and the non-governmental sector really looking to engage business and move it forward. But it was relatively, a lot of the time then was spent on defining what is the business case for a company to address sustainability. There were lots of voluntary initiatives. What the big thing I'd say has changed over that 25 years has been mainstreaming of the agenda. And I can chart a number of inflection points. So in the UK, the Climate Change Act setting binding climate targets in 2008, the Paris Agreement in 2015. But actually the big year that mainstreamed it for us was 2019. Which I at times I call the year of peak net zero in the UK. This was Extinction Rebellion on the streets, the government legislating for net zero. And on the carbon agenda in particular, before then, the government had been talking about 60 or 80% cuts in emissions. So, if you were in a sector like aviation that's a bit more difficult to abate, you could always be in part staking a claim, well, we'll be part of the 20% that's still emitting. Because it's quite difficult to cut our emissions. As soon as you get to zero, you've got no wriggle room. You've got to get to zero as well. So I think from 2019, we saw that mix of government and public pressure, but also increasingly and critically investor pressure has meant that it's become much more mainstream. So I've seen a shift from voluntary to more regulatory and investor driven has been one of the key changes over that time.
That's fascinating. Now, we are very clear when we speak with airlines and airline CEOs I have on this podcast, what is, your responsibility and sustainability. It's very easy. Airlines burn fuel. But when it comes to airports, I often get very differing responses. There are airports that are very happy just turning down the air conditioning 2 degrees and, hey, guess what? I'm saving some emissions right there. And then there are airports like Pittsburgh, which want to make SAF and export SAF to other airports. Are you able to, deep dive a little technical here? Scope 1 versus 2 versus 3. What does sustainability mean at an airport like Heathrow?
Yeah, happily. And I mean, the way we access this is through our carbon footprint, and I'll give you some percentages. So 95%, and by the way, we include flights in our carbon footprint. That's the key thing to say. And not just flights close to the airport in the landing and takeoff cycle, but all the way to their end destination. So in line with what the UK government and other governments report. So no surprise then that 95% of our carbon footprint is to do with aircraft, moving on the ground at Heathrow, taking off and then flying to their end destination. The other 5% is what we call all of that 95% carbon in the air. The other 5% is carbon on the ground. The vast majority of that is not controlled by Heathrow either. There are 3 or 4 main things. There's what we call surface access, airport speak for how you get to and from the airport on the ground as a passenger or a colleague, our supply chain, our airport vehicles, and our own terminal buildings. If you then hone in on the scope one emissions, the bit that we directly control because we buy the fuel for our vehicles or to heat our buildings, it's only 0.1% of the total footprint. So what does that tell you? The 0.1% we've absolutely got to sort out. It's our problem. We've got to get our own house in order. But we've also clearly got to roll across the 100%. And actually that's critical to our license to operate and our license to grow. And when investors or politicians or other stakeholders are talking to us, they want to know about everything. So we've set a plan across the whole footprint, and our role varies. We control some of it. Actually, for most of it, our role is either influence or advocacy. So to give a couple of examples, and we can talk about these, influence would be our landing charge incentive for sustainable aviation fuel. We don't buy fuel, but we can set a price incentive to help make it more affordable for airlines. And advocacy would be working with the UK government to advocate the kind of policies we need to scale some of these solutions. So it looks like getting our own house in order, but having a plan and taking action across the whole footprint.
Now, getting into specifics, and I will dive into your incentive, but your 2030 targets show a 15% reduction goal for flight emissions versus 45% for ground operations. Can you tell us how you aim to reach them, especially when you have little control over the flight emissions?
Yeah, happily. And just before I talk about how, I'll just say why we set those numbers. And when we were chatting before, I mentioned the UK climate change framework. So we've got really clear carbon budgets in the UK, and we said actually we should set our own carbon reduction targets in line with those. So the 15% is the Climate Change Committee's guidance on where aviation needs to be by 2030. And the 45% is its guidance for the whole of the economy. Bear in mind, those are both absolute reductions from 2019 to 2030. So they are, and I often talk about them internally as they are bold but plausible. Bold because we have to take ambitious action, but plausible because we need to be confident that we can get there. So in the air, it's a pretty similar recipe to what you'll have heard, I think, talking to others in the sector. And it anchors back to Sustainable Aviation, the coalition of airports, airlines, manufacturers in the UK, which was actually the first aviation sector globally back in 2020 to commit to net zero and publish a detailed plan. So it's a tried and tested recipe of operating more efficiently to begin with, both airspace modernisation and more efficient aircraft. And airlines at Heathrow are constantly investing in the newest aircraft. We're modernising airspace. That's all brilliant. It always makes sense to burn less fuel, but that won't get us to net zero. Given forecasting growth across the UK, it would keep emissions about stable, which is not enough. So then you turn to sustainable fuel, hydrogen and removals effectively. Sustainable fuel is the big part of the UK sector's plan to get to net zero, about 40% of the journey. And we might talk in a second about our landing charge incentive for SAF and some of the work we're doing with government to scale solutions and policy. Hydrogen, we think, is a really exciting technology initially for shorter journeys. It's a little bit further away, but we need to be preparing for it now and understanding the infrastructure. And depending how far we get with efficiency, sustainable aviation fuel and hydrogen, we then have to remove everything that's left. And that's basically the plan to get to the 15. Well, that's the plan to get to net zero by 2050, but it's also the plan to get to the 2030 goal. And then just very quickly on the ground, it's about 80% of the on-the-ground emissions are from surface access, so how people get to Heathrow. So it's about encouraging more people to come by public transport or active travel, walking or cycling. Lots of our colleagues live close to Heathrow. And we've set a target for 2026 that 45% of passengers will come by public transport to Heathrow. And then where people are driving, and people will still drive, it's about incentivizing them to use the cleanest and increasingly electric vehicles. So that's the big change on the ground. Supply chain's the second biggest emission on the ground. So it's about understanding where do emissions come from, and particularly with steel and concrete, quite carbon intensive materials, how do we step the standards to drive carbon out of our supply chain? And then small emissions but visible operational vehicles, shifting them to electric or biodiesel, and then switching off gas heating for the airport and switching that electric. That's the basic recipe on the ground.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you for distilling down the ground operations. And I had not realized that it's the commute, how people get to the airport, which is the largest part of ground emissions. It seems the way airports market that it's the electric vehicles pushing back aircraft that should be the number one. But this makes sense because whatever you've done, including the drop-off surcharge, I don't recall the last time I took a cab or drove to Heathrow. I have always taken the Heathrow Express, and I'm talking more than 20 or 30 instances in the last couple of years where I've taken the Heathrow Express or the Piccadilly line to Heathrow. And I think there was once when I took an Uber. I had too many bags. But even there, I course corrected, and I now use a service called Airporter, which takes my bag the day before.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, no, that's a good service.
Which is fantastic. And then I can, happily take the train with one little backpack or something. So
and the advantage, even Uber has got some ambitious targets to shift to electric vehicles increasingly. So even the Uber would be probably a clean or zero emission vehicle. The challenge, of course, for us with how people get to and from the airport, yes, it's about carbon and air pollution emissions. It's also about congestion on the roads as well, which is partly why surface access is important. And just a quick plug, obviously, for you mentioned Heathrow Express and Piccadilly line. We've also got the Elizabeth line now right through London, which is brilliant, a great addition to connectivity.
Works very well for our head of sustainability, Dirk Singer. He lives in Canary Wharf, so he just takes the Elizabeth line these days. He's really happy for that. Let's dive into your marquee initiative. Landing fee is how airports have traditionally made money. You have turned it around and used it as an instrument to encourage the adoption of SAF. Please tell us about this initiative and how it's been working.
Happily, and it's something we're really excited by, but it was a bit of an experiment in the early days. I mean, we saw SAF as a key part of the solution. We could see the same cost challenge as everyone. SAF is 2 to 4 or 5 times more expensive than kerosene, and like everyone else, we concluded, okay, that's a classic market failure. We need government to step in. And I'm sure we'll talk in a second about the kind of policies we need from government, mandates and incentives and so on. So we were pushing for those policies, but we said, well, that's not actually within our gift as Heathrow. So what lever could we pull that could help? So we looked at landing charges and introduced a scheme where basically we raise charges a little bit for every airline each year to create a pot of money. And we then set a target. So 2022, we started at 0.5%, and then each year it's gone up a bit to 1.5%. 2.5% this year and 3% next year. So we want 2.5% of all fuel at Heathrow this year to be sustainable fuel. So we create the pot, and airlines then bid into that pot. And actually, we've been oversubscribed in each year. So we then allocate depending on traffic movements. And at the end of the year, airlines have to provide evidence that they've uplifted the SAF, and then they get a rebate. So if you're an airline, and SAF is more expensive, this helps close that price gap. And we then have evidence that because of our incentive, SAF has flowed into the system and flowed to Heathrow. So we've sent, I guess the way we look at it is sending an early signal to the market to get SAF flowing. The interesting question for us over the next 3 or 4 years is we're now moving into a mandated world on SAF. So the government mandate comes in on the 1st of January. The question that we're actively consulting with airlines on now is how does this incentive best complement the mandate? And also, how can we incentivize second and even third generation sustainable fuels with our incentive? And we'll publish our plans on that next year. But no, we're really we're pleased with how it's worked. We've got about, I think, into next year's scheme, we've got approaching 20 airlines are interested, and the applications are closing around now. So it's been successful. And the challenge with SAF, as we all know, is we've got to scale it at speed. So that's the goal now.
Wow. I want to understand this a little better. My understanding is that SAF can be just injected into the tank or the pipeline, like it's at LAX, and all the airlines get it. How is it that you've got 20 airlines getting SAF and the rest not getting SAF? How does that work?
No, so you're absolutely right. SAF is injected into the system, and that's one of the beauties of SAF is it is a drop-in solution. So it's blended upstream and just arrives blended in at Heathrow. But the incentive works on individual airlines buying SAF to be injected into the system upstream and then providing the evidence to us that they bought the SAF. So yes, the molecules go everywhere, but it's only one airline that's actually paid for it. They can then claim the carbon credits of that, and we know the total amount of SAF that's been delivered at Heathrow.
That's very interesting. And I don't know of too many airports that cordon off revenues. Usually revenues that come in just go into a bottomless pit is just for everyone, right? Was there pushback when you tried to do this from other airlines? Like, hey, you're taking my money and increasing charges for me, and only certain airlines get to benefit. I wonder what went on behind the scenes.
So I'll talk a bit about that. The first thing to say is that we're economically regulated in the UK. So the Civil Aviation Authority will set how much we can charge airlines and how much we can invest. So just to make it absolutely clear to your listeners, this isn't Heathrow doesn't make money in any way from this scheme. It's what we'd call revenue neutral. So we effectively shape the charges, so we're recycling the revenue to help airlines. We have to consult on our charges to airlines each year as part of that regulatory setup. So we published very openly the intention, and we took feedback. And actually, have we had particular challenge from airlines? Not particularly yet, actually. I guess as the percentages get a bit higher, we may see some of that. But I think the evidence so far has been this is a valuable incentive. The fact that each year, so 22, it was introduced over the last 3 years, each year a few more airlines have joined the scheme, I think shows that it's a valuable scheme. and people can see the intent behind it. So no, we're pleased with how it's worked so far.
SAF is important to you because I remember flying out of Heathrow a few months ago and you were running a public awareness campaign around sustainable aviation fuels as well. I think you did a study where less than 20% of the passengers were familiar with what SAF is. Why this education campaign for passengers and not just airlines?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because it's funny, isn't it? I think SAF is such an important solution for aviation, but it's not particularly well understood. And I think that's partly, I've talked to industry colleagues and others around that. I think it's partly because the plane doesn't look any different and the infrastructure doesn't look any different. It's the fuel that's flowing through and no one really sees that. So we thought we actually need to raise awareness of this and raise awareness that it can help cut carbon. It's part of our transition to net zero. So I think the campaign you're talking about was called the Fly Up, so a pun on the English, full English breakfast, a fry up. And it was a kind of PR campaign where the oil used to cook breakfast was collected and made into SAF. And obviously that was in very small quantities. We never said anything other. But what it did do is just make it more accessible to people and got some great pickup in the media. But I do think there's a wider challenge for the sector that we need to continue that education campaign. I think the Virgin 100% SAF flight was great last year. Again, some great media engagement around that, a kind of world first flight right the way across the Atlantic. And that's part of how do we continue to raise awareness. We do also offer, still on our website, it's worth saying, the opportunity to buy SAF as well. So you can log in and you can choose up to 100% SAF for your flight. I mean, most people, if they're looking to do something like that, they'll do it at the point that they buy the ticket from an airline rather than the airport. But we thought that's an important tool to have available as well.
Still staying on SAF.
Sure.
What do you say to detractors? And I don't even mean passengers who don't know about this. There was recently David Neilman on stage arguing with IATA chief Willie Walsh. You know, we don't need to buy SAF and instead we should be doing other things like growing. And there was Tony Fernandez recently on stage who said, quote unquote, SAF is stupid. How do you talk to airline leaders who want to grow, but perhaps don't believe that there is enough cooking oil to go around? Mm-hmm. Obviously, there isn't. Yeah. And they're stuck in that paradigm.
Yeah, it's a good question. And what I would say is there are detractors at that end of the spectrum saying, you know, SAF is stupid. There are also, and we feel it particularly with some of the environmental groups in the UK, detractors saying, well, SAF isn't sustainable enough. And, you know, it's not the best solution for aviation. We should stop flying. And I think we need to engage in both of those debates. So I think to those saying that it's not the right answer, I think our view is the global sector collectively is committed to get to net zero. And if you look at every study published by governments or business groups or aviation around the world, SAF is the biggest solution. The percentages vary a bit, but it's the single biggest solution to get aviation to net zero. It's proven. It's powered hundreds of thousands of flights, the Virgin flights. We know it works. We know it cuts life cycle carbon. But we also know it costs more, so we need to find the right solutions to scale it up so economies of scale and learning effects kick in and the costs fall. And I'd also say to people who, you know, you gave the example of people saying, well, there's not enough cooking oil. We need to move through the generations of SAF. So yes, much SAF at the moment is made from waste oils. In the UK, we've got a particular focus on other forms of waste to make second generation SAF, so municipal waste, agricultural, forestry, even waste gases. And actually, the big focus then is third generation SAF, so what people would call power to liquid or eSAF, where you're combining renewable hydrogen and captured carbon. So we need to scale those up. And by the way, in the UK, we think there's plenty of feedstock to domestically produce around 2/3 of our SAF by 2030 from a mixture of second generation waste SAF and PTL. So I think feedstock is available. And then to the green groups who say, well, it's not a perfect solution, I'd say SAF we're in a transition now. We don't have to be 100% zero carbon tomorrow. SAF on average will save up to 70% or more life cycle emissions. That's 70% better than we were. And eventually with eSAF and with other technologies, we'll get to 100%. But it's about getting carbon out of the world economy as quickly as possible. And it helps in that goal.
Yeah, every single step helps. And I think public comments like this from airline executives do not help the industry. Just putting it out there.
Indeed. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that in the UK, and so if I look across the geographies I'm most familiar with, the UK, Europe, US, I guess, where we've spent most of our time working in partnership on SAF initiatives. That message on SAF is not one I've heard much or at all, actually. There's a strong focus on SAF as the solution and scaling it. But yeah, except that's not true everywhere. So.
We've discussed SAF in detail, but SAF, like you said, is a transition fuel. Hydrogen, many say, is the fuel of the future. And the stat I heard shared recently at an event in London was if Heathrow is to power all its flights with hydrogen in the future, you need to build a hydrogen storage facility the size of T4. How do you do that? Is hydrogen a feasible option at all?
Another great question. And actually, just quickly on SAF, I was really careful to say not to say it's a transition fuel, because actually our view is for long haul flights at the moment, it's really the only solution that we can see. Let's see how technology evolves. And I think we have to scale SAF up to solve that. I think hydrogen looks interesting and exciting for shorter journeys. And the research we've done suggests that hydrogen will start small and scale, so turboprops, then potentially to narrow bodies. So actually, and we've done quite a bit of research here. A colleague in my team, Matt Prescott, has led a lot of our work here researching hydrogen initiatives. And we've concluded that probably through until so first thing is we think we'll see the first services by hydrogen aircraft at some point in the 30s, potentially in the early 30s, with turboprops, subject to the technology being developed and regulatory approvals and so on. Now, actually, those aircraft serve a pretty small number of Heathrow routes, some of our domestic routes, but we could see turboprops serving some of our routes. We think actually truck delivery of hydrogen both to the airport and then moving it around is enough, probably until at least the early 2040s. But you're right, at some stage, let's assume a narrow body hydrogen plane enters service. Three things will need to happen at Heathrow. The first is a new pipeline to bring hydrogen here as a gas. The second is some kind of liquefaction machinery facilities at Heathrow to make gas into a liquid, and then a new hydrant system, so pipes under the airport to move it around. And each of those is quite significant bits of infrastructure investment with quite significant cost. So we are key, and you're right, I've seen projections of different sizes of land that we might need to liquefy hydrogen. And by the way, it's not just the space, it's lots of electricity at the moment as well. So we are keeping a very active watching brief on this. We have this year we appointed what we think is the world's first professor of airport decarbonisation, Tom Budd, based at Cranfield University. And a big part of his research is understanding how the airport infrastructure might need to change to incorporate hydrogen. We've borrowed one of the stands in our cargo area, stand 601, to test different kinds of hydrogen turnaround procedures and vehicles in future as well, so that we understand what's needed from the airport perspective, and we're prepared. And then we're working through the Jet Zero task force in the UK to collaborate with others. So as an ecosystem, we're moving together because, and this is a classic ecosystem challenge, Airbus could invent a hydrogen plane, but unless we can fuel it and other airports can fuel it, you haven't got a transport system. So,
yeah, I'm going to come back, and thank you for shedding light from your airport perspective here. I'm going to come back to this Jet Zero task force you mentioned, but just to conclude one aspect around your emission goals, when we were doing the research, you have a 18% NOx reduction target by 2030 as well. That's an interesting one that we don't usually see airports pay a lot of attention to. Why is that important, and how are you getting there?
Yeah, so it's important for us because Heathrow is located very close to London, which is brilliant in terms of connectivity for the city and jobs and growth, but does mean that some of the downsides of the airport, air pollution, which is NOx, but also noise, are in quite sharp relief for people. So if you were an airport in the middle of the countryside, NOx might be less of an issue because you don't have as many people living nearby. It's more of an issue for Heathrow. So actually, we've set two targets. The 18% is everything airside, including aircraft, and the 60% is non-aircraft related NOx reductions. And the great news here is that everything we're doing to cut carbon will also deliver air quality benefits. So it's a pretty similar recipe of measures. It's incentivizing cleaner planes. So our landing charges also charge less for the latest generation of aircraft. And our goal is that by we think today around 63% of those aircraft meet the latest ICAO standards for air quality. So they're clean aircraft. That's made a big difference improving air quality over the years. But then it is the switch to public transport that we talked about earlier. That's important for air quality. The switch to EVs makes a huge difference. And bear in mind, I talk about surface access there. The big contributor to air pollution around the airport is actually local roads, which is something people don't always kind of understand or put together initially, because you think, well, hold on, you've got these big aircraft. But actually, as aircraft take off, the pollution disperses quite quickly, whereas cars and vehicles are driving around closer to where people live. So actually, it's the investment we've made in public transport, rail links and bus links, and it's the shift to EVs, which is making a real difference there.
I can't wait for a day when we see Heathrow becoming like a Schiphol and high-speed trains coming through Schiphol as well from outside of London, through Heathrow from outside of London, not just from central London. That'll be quite cool.
Yeah, no, it will. And I think, we are improving our integrated transport for sure. I think the links into London are, as we talked about earlier, have improved massively over the years and are really good now. I think our focus is on how through bus and coach links we can connect to other parts of the country. And then as High Speed 2 arrives through a link at Old Oak Common. Yeah, no, agree.
Right. Zooming out of Heathrow a bit, you've, of course, played a very active role in UK's aviation and sustainability policy, both on the Jet Zero Council previously and now Jet Zero Task Force, as well as you used to lead a group called Sustainable Aviation. Tell us about the work you have done in both of these places to bring the airport perspective, and how's the feedback loop been going?
So I'll start with Sustainable Aviation, which actually was, because that and the Jet Zero Task Force are linked. Sustainable Aviation was launched actually nearly 20 years ago. I think it's our 20th birthday next year, to bring together airports, airlines, manufacturers, and NATS, the Air Traffic Control Service in the UK, to set a joint strategy on sustainability. So we think it was one of the first times that kind of sectoral approach had been taken. And then we were the first globally, as I said, to set that net zero ambition and publish a plan. And I think it's a recognition really that, yes, there are things that individual airports and airlines and manufacturers can do and must do, but actually there are some things where we need to work in partnership together. And it has been a really effective partnership over those years, and I think valued as a voice by government and other stakeholders as well. The link into the Jet Zero Task Force, actually initially it was a group of airline industry chief execs brought together through Sustainable Aviation that wrote to the government 4 or 5 years ago and set out the real value of that kind of partnership model of working. And that was one of the factors in leading the Jet Zero Council, as it then was, Task Force as it now is, to be set up. And that for us is really valuable as a way of engaging directly with government at a senior level, and agreeing the work plan and the priorities and who needs to do what to decarbonize, and then holding each other to account. So I think it was great to see it under the last administration. It's been great to see the new administration in the UK committing to that partnership model. As we said, a task force, not a council. They're talking about something that is more agile, outcomes focused, a bit smaller as a group, but still that same intent of working in partnership, which we're hugely supportive of.
And what about the latest Jet Zero Task Force under the UK government? I believe that's much more action-oriented. Are we likely to see more of the flights like 100% SAF on Virgin Atlantic?
So actually the first meeting of the full, what they call the plenary at Chief Exec and Secretary of State level, was a couple of days ago. And we haven't had a full readout of that yet, but I think it had a strong focus on SAF on the agenda. And so I would expect to see strong continuing joint work on the policies we need on SAF, the mandate the government's introducing, the revenue certainty mechanism. And then under that, you've got an expert panel, which is smaller, co-chaired by the minister, but Holly Boyd-Boland from Virgin Atlantic as well. So you've got an industry and government co-chair, and I think 15 or 16 experts. That's the group that I'll be on. With task and finish groups up to 4, and we've yet to define what those are, but I'd be amazed if there wasn't something SAF related in that, something hydrogen related, maybe something focused on removals and non-CO2 as well, with a very specific action focus. So I think you're right, action and outcomes focused.
I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of this and what's different. You've, of course, also taken a very proactive approach in involving airlines that fly into Heathrow in your sustainability journey. How is it that those airlines, the stakeholders, are feeding into your sustainability strategy?
Well, I suppose I mentioned sustainable aviation. So at a national level, we work very closely, and I would say we have a joint plan on net zero, but also on noise issues through that group. And then at an airport level, I mean, the first thing to say is that we're regulated actually as an airport. I mentioned earlier the role of the CAA. So our own investments and actions that we're taking, we need to consult extensively with airlines on. So they are very actively involved. I talk regularly to our big airline customers, what we call the home base carriers, British Airways and Virgin, but the other, both individual airlines and groupings of airlines that fly into the UK. So this, in our 5-year business plan at the moment, we put forward a case for what we call a carbon and sustainability investment program. So investing in everything from airspace modernization to EV charging points to switching off gas heating. We set out those plans to airlines and the Civil Aviation Authority, the CAA, to get their views and support for that. And we're setting out our plans for the next 5-year period at over the next year or so. And we work collaboratively, even outside of that regulatory process, on the hydrogen stand I mentioned earlier, Stand 601, where we're testing different technologies. British Airways are involved in that. On noise, we've got a technical engagement forum with airlines to discuss new processes and procedures we can use to cut noise. And I was remembering actually, when you sent through some of the questions you might ask, that I was thinking, what's the earliest collaboration I can remember with airlines on carbon outside of the Sustainable Aviation Group? And there was something called the Aviation Global Deal Group in about 2008, which was us, Cathay Pacific, BA, Virgin, Qatar, Finnair, looking at the kind of global solution that we needed and setting out some ideas on global carbon pricing and global emissions trading, which we think fed into some of the thinking that then became the Corsia scheme. So, it's a long history of collaboration.
Wow, that's fantastic. Towards the end, I have to ask you and get you to address the elephant in the room. The new government in the UK has said they'll be open to a third runway at Heathrow as long as the overall emissions from aviation remain the same. But we know a third runway will lead to growth. Isn't this a catch-22? How do you grow and potentially add a third runway, excluding the cement? I'm talking scope 3 emissions here. How do you ensure that emissions can be controlled despite having a third runway? How do you balance both of these goals?
Well, I mean, the short answer is we're going to have to, because the policy that supports a third runway at Heathrow, which has existed for several years in the UK, is really clear that in bringing forward our plans, we have to demonstrate how we will meet the UK's climate targets, and they are very clearly heading towards net zero. So I talked, effectively, our net zero plan is designed to get us to net zero even with a third runway. So let me just unpack that a bit. We took the climate pathway, the net zero aligned climate pathway for aviation from the UK's Climate Change Committee as our kind of guiding pathway that we needed to try and follow for our net zero plan. And when we were developing the plan we published in 2022, we tested all of the levers that we needed to pull. And I talked through earlier, this is particularly a challenge for flight emissions from flights, although clearly we need to solve for surface access and supply chain and construction as well. But for flights, we set out the measures I talked about earlier, the combination of efficiency, SAF, hydrogen and removals that can get us there. And we're confident that it can be done, but we need to act with urgency and purpose as Heathrow in scaling up some of the solutions where we have control, in influencing through the SAF incentive I talked about. And we also need the government to act with urgency and purpose on the kind of policies we need to scale SAF, scale hydrogen, and scale removals. So it can be done, but we've got to act quickly, and we will expect to be held to account on that ambition over time. We set very clearly when we published the net zero plan this ambition that 29 would be the year of peak carbon for Heathrow. So even as we grow and recover, we're on track so far. But look, we've identified it as probably the most significant mid to long term risk facing certainly our business, and I would say wider aviation. So it gets a huge amount of senior leadership focus internally, working with others in the sector, and that will continue over time. I think it is, but that's what makes it, back to your earlier question about 16 years at Heathrow, that's what makes it such an exciting area to work in, because, I and I guess much like you, talking to you before, Shashank, you've been valued and got huge benefit from being able to travel around the world. Travel enables some of the most positive things we do, connecting and exploring and cooperating around the world. But we won't be able to protect those benefits unless we can take the carbon out of flying. So, which is a huge motivating force, I think, for all of us to drive at the problem.
Wow. It is indeed fantastic and heartening to know, because you're right. I'm a product of aviation and flying, and it's integral to who I am as an individual, and both professionally and personally. And I'm sure this is the case for lots of people we know in our circles. So this is close to heart for us. Do you truly believe that, in general, growth in aviation can be balanced successfully with sustainability, environmental sustainability?
Yeah, I think it can. And I think, I was reflecting personally, it's been such a kind of personal driver for me, the sustainability agenda, and really kind of core to my values for as long as I can remember, that actually I wouldn't be doing this job if I didn't think that was possible. I think it is challenging. And and by the way, it throws up new challenges constantly as well. We need to keep driving at what are the right solutions in this space. But absolutely, I think it can be done, and not just on carbon, meeting air pollution limits, continuing to reduce noise impacts. If you're an airport like Heathrow, these are all important issues. I think to your point on growth, the way I also look at it, and I've had this debate in the UK. There's a well-known school of thought, not just in the UK, around the world, that the only solution is to stop flying. And I suppose one of the arguments back is, even if for that to work as a solution, you'd need to believe that everyone in the world is going to stop flying. And even in the UK, where there's quite a heated debate on the impacts of flying and should I feel guilty about flying, we've seen after the pandemic, people want to travel. So even in the UK, where people are very aware of these issues, there's a big forecast growth in flying. And in many other parts of the world, aviation has been a smaller industry historically, and people see huge opportunity in it. They want to travel, and that's it's in Asia Pacific, India, Latin America. That's where some of the big future growth is. So, and I don't think it's a realistic policy proposal to say that actually we're going to be able to limit growth in aviation around the world, because people value what travel brings. But we've also got to solve for net zero. We've got to get there. So we're going to have to find a way of making it work. The good news is the solutions are clear. The combination of efficiency and SAF and hydrogen and removals. The exact balance between those, let's see as the technologies emerge and the costs change of those. But the basic recipe is clear. The challenge now is scaling the solutions as quickly as we can.
Fantastic. Matt, you've done a fantastic, quite inspiring job at Heathrow, and I do hope lots of airports and other organizations get to listen to this podcast and are able to replicate these in their organizations. Now, the final part of this interview is called the rapid fire round, in which we get to know you a bit more personally. I'll ask you Very, very simple questions. Okay. So, and you got to give me one-line answers. Like, what's your favorite book?
My favorite book is Haroon and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie.
Wow. Fantastic. This is the first time that book has been mentioned on this podcast. So glad to know. Okay. Favorite movie?
Favorite movie is Jumanji, because we watched it a lot. Not the old Jumanji, although I do like that, but the two new Jumanjis, because the kids love them and they're brilliant.
You won't believe it. 2 days ago, I met the person on whom the first Jumanji is based. Remember, it was a son and father in Massachusetts who ran a shoe factory?
Yes.
I met the son.
No.
And guess what? He has not watched it. He has not watched Jumanji. He just knows that it so happened. And I said, well, it was a huge hit. And it was one of my favorite movies growing up as a kid as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. Favorite airline?
Now, this is a really tricky one. I'm not sure I can answer this because, look, if as Heathrow, I say British Airways, our biggest customer, then Virgin Atlantic will say, oh, that's favoritism. So it's a very dangerous question. Maybe I'd say Cathay Pacific because it's a non-UK based carrier and I have enjoyed flying with them in the past.
Okay, good one. Your favorite city?
Paris.
Okay, that's a short hop. Do you fly to Paris or do you take the train to Paris?
Normally the train, actually. Yeah, I have flown sometimes, but yeah.
Okay, good to know. Walking the talk here. What do you do in your free time?
Well, free time now, I've got a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old, so a lot of it is kind of geared around taking them to their activities, drama and football and things. But I loved going to the cinema in the past, and now that's more like binge watching, Netflix or Apple TV, trying to keep more or less fit. And I do like picking up a camera or a book when I get time. So.
Have you watched Extrapolations on Apple TV?
No, but I'm always after good advice. So
This Christmas, Extrapolations.
Excellent. Shrinking is our current favourite on Apple TV, which we really enjoy.
Okay, what is something you'd like to learn?
Japanese. Just because I originally studied languages, French and Spanish, but I love the idea of learning a language with a completely different alphabet and script.
Wow. Okay. And finally, the best advice you received.
The best advice, and it was when I was thinking about what to study at university, is just do what you love. So I studied languages, then went back to study environmental science because that was another passion. So I did that at masters, and that's kind of guided my career. And that's brought me to where I am now. So yeah, do what you're passionate about, and you'll enjoy it.
And final question: if we are speaking 1 year from now and we are popping champagne, what are we celebrating?
We are celebrating beating our SAF incentive target at Heathrow for next year. So it's oversubscribed and we've gone above the 3%.
I love it. Fantastic work, Matt. And thank you. It's been a pleasure finally speaking with you.
Yeah, brilliant to speak to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries. Yet, there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simpliflying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simpliflying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Mira Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Lihia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simpliflying and your host. please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.